All right, so now we're going to start our discussion of our last and final modern motor control theory. It's called ecological theory, and again, it's outlined in your book, so if you want to read a little bit more, and I would strongly encourage you to read that first chapter of Shumway, Cook, and Willicott in regards to the theories. So there's an outline there, and I'm also going to put up a new article for you guys. It's called it's the first author's last name is Davids, and it was published in 2012. It's actually, a lot of the article talks about things that may not be as important to you. You're welcome to read the whole article, but for sure, starting on page 2, most of page 2, it talks about the ecological dynamics and general principles of motor learning, and it really focuses on ecological theory. So it's not very long. It's one page, page 114. So the second page of the article, and it does a great job of sort of reviewing some of the basics for ecological theory. All right, so we're going to start our discussion. Pull out your table and start making notes as I'm talking, and then we'll discuss how ecological theory at the end applies to physical therapy. So ecological theory was first introduced by James Gibson, who was a psychologist in the 1960s, and his daughter, I believe her name is Elizabeth Gibson, has carried on her work and published some work in ecological theory as well. So Dr. Gibson theorized that we not only take in sensory information, so it's not a passive perception or taking in of sensory information, but we actively perceive the environment. So we are actively looking at the environment and trying to seek out the information that we need that will help us to reach our goals. So the theory focuses on how motor behavior is geared to specifically meet the needs of our environment and the task. So again, our motor behavior is shaped so that we actually meet our task goals, but we take into account the environment and all the nuances of the task. You also may hear this called the perception action system, in which we're actively exploring the environment to satisfy goals. And again, perception is not the same as sensation. That sensation is the activation of sensory receptors, whereas perception is perceiving. It's an active process where we apply some meaning to the sensory information that we get. So again, perceptions are based on previous experience, and experience is what improves and strengthens our perceptions, and the variety of experiences that we have make our perceptions or help us build very strong perceptions. So as we sort of go back and look at the key concepts of ecological theory, there's basically three main concepts of what Gibson sort of suggests is happening as somebody is using environmental cues and how they actually do that. The first concept is as you are doing a task and learning a task, you learn to focus on very specific sensory input. And when you're focusing on this input and you're going through repeated or repetitions of this behavior, this task, what you're doing is you're forming or improving your perception about what that sensory input means. And then you're also learning which action assists you when you're getting a specific sensory or perceptual picture. So you're starting to figure out which perceptions and which sensory inputs help you with those perceptions are important as you're acting within the environment. The concept number 2 says that you form these relationships that are to specific perceptions and specific actions. So not only are you figuring out what sensory input, you're figuring out what about this sensory input is important to me, and how does that relate specifically to an action. So if I see a change in the environment and perceive the environment is changing this way, how do I change my motor response? And the third part of this is calibration. So you have very specific scaling or calibrations to changes in perception. So you see and you calibrate a change in perception, and you calibrate that to the specific motor response that you need. So it's a calibration relationships. You're scaling how much this sensory input changes to how much I need to change my motor behavior or my motor output. So if we move on and we look at some of the limitations that have been outlined in the literature in relation to ecological theory, we definitely see how ecological theory sort of de-emphasizes the functioning of the nervous system. So it doesn't discuss how the different parts of the nervous system or different parts of the central nervous system in the brain sort of work together to perceive. It's really focused more on this relationship between perception to action and how these two link and calibrate to each other. As far as clinical implications, it really emphasizes our need to examine the ability of our patients to explore the environment and perceive what's going on in the environment, and also the ability to adapt. So when I see a change in the environment, that I modify my motor output, and then it helps me be successful to complete the task no matter what the environmental change is. So it really is a very close emphasis on that relationship between perception, and then once I perceive it, how I change my movement and how much. So that calibration of change between perception to action. All right, so what we're going to do now is just like we've done for the last actually 7 theories, we're going to pause here. I want you to pull out your table. I want you to jot down a few ideas about how ecological theory affects history, examination, evaluation, and intervention from a clinician perspective. And then once you jot down a few ideas, I want you to stop and talk to some classmates and see what they wrote down. And then once you have had a good discussion about it and you think you've got some ideas, I want you to restart the video and we will complete our last theory, discussion of our last theory and how it impacts physical therapy in the clinic. All right, so if we think about the application of ecological theory to physical therapy practice, and we start with history, some things that were going to be important for us in history is, of course, we want the sensory systems to be healthy and be able to give us accurate perceptions. And we want to look at how much experience potentially you've had with a specific motor behavior. Lack of experience may indicate not having the ability to learn the relationship between perception and action. And then, of course, as far as motor behavior changes, do we have the motor system that will allow us to make the motor behavior changes that are required for whatever task you're looking at? As far as examination, we're going to watch the person do a task, and during that observation, we're going to look at if they're successful in perceiving the environment and then also perceiving environmental changes. Do they have the ability then to match the changes in the environment to the appropriate motor system that needs to be modified? And can they calibrate their motor behavior to the change in perception? As far as evaluation, again, we're going to be thinking about the relationship between perception and action. And if somebody's having an issue, that relationship between perception and action may have a limitation. So you may want to look at issues with again, perception, problems with selecting or updating the motor behavior in the way that's going to, again, help them be successful? Or is it an issue between calibration of motor behavior correctly? As far as intervention, we want to focus on improving perception, improving how we update or modify motor behaviors to adapt to these changes in the environment. And we want to look at improving calibration of these motor responses. So we're going to improve the motor behavior output through repetition and feedback, which again successfully focuses the learner on correctly perceiving the environment, selecting the correct motor response to improve their performance, and then also calibrating the relationship between perception and action. All right, so we've concluded our discussion about all the modern theories in motor control, and we're going to have a few conclusions here in the very last video, and we're going to talk about the task-oriented approach and what that means to us as physical therapists. You may not have noticed, but from the last 5 modern motor control theories, when we talked about examination, we always started with the task. So we're going to discuss why we did that. All right, so tune into the last lecture and we'll wrap up this topic.